All right, great day, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos. It's good to be back. It's been a minute. I was out with the family taking a little bit of vacation. I appreciate Ken, Paul, and Jim stepping in and putting out a lot of great content for our Gadfly subscribers. So thank you for that, gentlemen. And today I want to just do a deep dive. I know you guys have previously discussed a little bit, but just in regards to America, the experiment, taking a look at the current, what I'm kind of deeming the color revolution that's taking place. And I think it's worth just kind of circling back and having a deep dive, because I think unfortunately we're missing a very unique opportunity here to assess things as we navigate through the current economic reset, gentlemen. So good day, and thank you guys for joining today.
Morning, and good to have you back, CJ.
Yes, and yes, very pleased that you're back, but pleased you also had a wonderful holiday, so that's good.
Yeah, well, it started, again, just, looking at, I don't want to rehash everything that we've commented on, but there was a great article that was put out yesterday by Pepe Escobar, and it really details in regards to why America's revolution, won't be televised. And there's, a few points in here, and, trying to assess, and again, don't want to downplay the tragedy of, what occurred with the loss of life and people's feelings and everything that's taken place. However, I think the bigger piece of it is the landscape of what has been created through the lockdown. And then obviously this is just kind of like, just the beginning of it. But gentlemen, let's discuss that. What are your thoughts? We've had a couple of days to assess things that are taking place. I'll let Paul start, and then Ken, you can follow up with it. Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, it's one of the, to be honest, it's an enormous thing, because I mean, on Twitter, someone, I can't remember what I was tweeting about, but someone said, oh, I said something about the solutions are relatively simple, but the implementation of them is a monumental problem. And also, there's some fundamental changes. I mean, we'll discuss the US, but let's be absolutely fair about this. It applies to Western nations in general, but I think the US is a more extreme example, perhaps unsurprisingly. But the fundamental thing is everybody's always imagining that there's going to be some big change because this is going to happen. There's going to be these mass arrests, or there's going to be this big fundamental shift in government, and all these things are going to suddenly manifest themselves out of nowhere, and that will resolve everything. Well, it won't, because the fundamental problem is until people are able to collectively come together. I think there's a lot of people now acknowledging there's huge problems in the United States, and looking at, as someone who looks in from the outside, there are enormous fundamental problems that need to be addressed. I think people are now have reached breaking point for a whole bunch of reasons. The lockdown's part of it. There's economic reasons, there's societal reasons, there's financial reasons, there's corporate reasons, there's banking reasons, there's everything. Everything's now in this utter state of turmoil and chaos, and everyone's trying to find their place in that. And they're not sure. They've started to go, hang on, something's not right. I don't really understand necessarily everything. But there needs to be some way of collectively galvanizing people together and saying, okay, there's a major problem and we need to start to address this. We need to have adult discussions. And yes, it's fine for people to protest, and everyone will have different reasons and disagree with why some people are protesting or what they're protesting about. But that's just an expression of frustration. I mean, in no way would I ever condone anyone committing any acts of violence or anything of that nature, or smashing property or doing any of these things. It's completely deplorable and unacceptable. And yes, there is organization in that, which will make certain people are there just for an agenda, just for the hell of smashing things up for the sake of it. But there's going to be people doing this because they are totally frustrated. They don't know what to do anymore. They feel completely disenfranchised, disaffected. So there's a whole bunch of people, for all different reasons, have reached the point where they've said enough's enough. There's something really has to change. I don't think it's exclusive to the US by any stretch. We're seeing increasing evidence in the UK of this. But the problem is people politicize it. So they're looking at it politically, going, oh, well, they're doing this for this reason. This is this agenda. This is this agenda. And there are some agendas, but there's a lot of people who are just latching onto things through frustration, through anger, and there's problems societally in the United States that go back decades and probably even longer than that, that never got addressed. And when you stack all this up, it's no wonder the US is where it is today. The question is, how do you galvanize people? And the first thing I think, and I've said this more times than I care to remember, people need to understand how dysfunctional the political system is. It serves no interest. You can stake a claim on one side of the fence or the other, and people do. The thing I find astonishing is there's things that are being done now that people don't like because it's the Trump administration. And there's people who are on the Trump side who don't like something the opposition does. But if the roles were reversed, if you now had a Democrat, administration doing the things Trump was doing, the Trump supporters would be disagreeing with it just because it's the Democrat. Well, for me, we have to get past for me, I'm sorry to say, it's a juvenile attitude. We need to start to say this. We've got to get rid of politics from our understanding and then work out what do we do. And I've had a million ideas about what needs to be done, and I'm not going to go into those today in great detail. But as I said 3 years ago, I wrote a rather extensive letter to the Trump administration saying, you're on the cusp of something, and if you don't act now, you're going to have major problems further down the line within your term of office, because from my perspective, the US economy was going to implode. We were going to have problems. That is then going to manifest itself in all the ways, that we're starting to see. And, this may fizzle out relatively quickly. It might not do, but it's the start of something, and it's not going to go away, because as the economy collapses, you're going to get more and more disenfranchised people, disaffected people who are sick of the system and get fed up with because they feel they've been let down. Because they lose their jobs, and as things get worse and worse, people's retirement starts to get affected. So it's going to engulf pretty much, not everybody, but the vast majority of people. And the question is, how do they all respond and act to that? So this is the inflection point for me. It's the start of something. And I'll let Ken talk now, because obviously I think I've probably said enough as a kind of introduction.
No, Paul, that was great. Very well said. Ken, go for it.
Yeah, there were a number of things you mentioned in there, Paul. And, since we did our podcast on Monday, I think it was.
Yes.
I've looked at a lot, and I've kept an open mind, seeing things, and I've come to the realization that what we're seeing right now is a combination of so many different factors you can't even label them all. One in particular, the consequence of locking down people, the consequence of people not even knowing if they're going to have a job anymore, the politics. And you said that we've got to have a dialogue. The fact of the matter is, as I've come to the realization that there is no dialogue, it reminds me of just before the start of World War I, where all of the nations in Europe, not just the alliances that France and Russia had and Germany and Austria-Hungary had, it was that everybody had accumulated so much modern technology and weapons that inevitably you're going to use them. And even under the Schlieffen Plan, they talked about war in Europe is inevitable. It's just a matter of, should we do it now or wait until it comes upon us? Tsar Nicholas attempted to tell his cousin, the Kaiser, hey, we don't want to get involved with this, okay? We're mustering because, things are happening, but we don't want to. And the Kaiser in the meantime was saying, well, you know what, we're going to have to support here. And inevitably there was no dialogue. They had the bit in the teeth. History and fate were running the course, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. And I see that now. The fact of the matter is you can't have a dialogue. You have the hard extreme core, whether you want to call them Trump supporters or hard right. You have the progressives that what started out in this protest for George Floyd has turned into a burn down the entire system, kill cops, kill anybody who's against them. I mean, the division in America, which may have started, percolating back with Occupy Wall Street and the global financial crisis, has reached a boiling point. And it's not about what's best for America and best for Americans. It's about political power at all costs. This is why we have gone from day one when Trump won, there was the demand for recount in Michigan. And then there was suddenly the Russian hoax BS. And then he's getting impeached over Ukraine to cover up Biden and his son and the corruption that the Democrats were doing, and COVID-19, and he's being vilified there. It's just on and on and on. Every single thing that has been going on, including individuals that Trump wants in his administration working against him, has been about the absolute achievement of political power. We take a look at Antifa. Antifa was prepared. They were in Minneapolis the day after announcement of protests were coming on. The governors and mayors are letting it happen. I mean, think about the hypocrisy. Some of the mayors are marching, and Pelosi is marching with the protesters and the rioters, but you're not allowed to have 10 people for a funeral. You're not allowed to have religious ceremonies. The hypocrisy, because the agenda for political domination is full bore. Now, of course, you take into consideration that all of this is happening, just like the COVID-19, all this happened right when the world was on the cusp of another global financial collapse. And in the meantime, what happened? What happened earlier this week or yesterday that the protests have now sent to the back burner? The Senate Judiciary interviews over Obamagate and the whole FISA thing. Nobody's paying attention to that because they're wondering if their neighborhood is going to be run over by these communist brown shirts or black shirts. The fact of the matter is this. I know that we've talked in the past, Paul, about the deep state is dead and it's dying and whatever. They still have tremendous amount of power and money, and they're not going to go down swinging or easily.
I agree. Yeah, sorry, just to briefly. Yeah, look, they may have lots of dollars, but that's a moot point given the dollar's collapsing. But I'll just want to briefly interrupt because there's something for me that is starting to become apparent that wasn't this apparent, but it related to this power structure or power grab or whatever that's going on in the US at the moment. Sorry, didn't want to interrupt, but I just
that's fine.
Put that train of thought in so I don't forget.
Yep.
So I'll let you carry on. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, I fully understand. And the thing about it is look, I know I always like to use parallels in history. Mark Twain is dead right. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. Whenever you have this populist era, this populist frequency that usually starts about the second decade of every century and culminates sometimes into the third or fourth decade, this type of thing is reaching a boiling point. So there's tons of money, especially since the one percenters and the wealth disparity has reached that, has reached the same points we had in 1929 and leading the Great Depression. The money is there, and you have entire generations of kids, the millennials, the Generation Zs, who are willing participants. You don't even have to pay them that much. They just are more than willing to tear down the system. Now, these are what Lenin, of course, used to call useful idiots. They don't realize it, but the fact of the matter is throughout history, there are always useful idiots. And I'll end on my intro on this. For those who may go back to 1968, because this seems so much like 1968. 1968, one of the Chicago Seven, Jerry Rubin, at the DNC in Chicago, Jerry Rubin has a famous quote that said, "The long hairs have mediators in the movement and revolution, where the millionaire businessmen use these mediators to pay the frontline activists to do the work." All of this, that whether you go back to the hippie movement, where you go back to Antifa, where you go back to here, all the revolution, it's not homegrown, it's not spawning from the people. It's always paid, it's always agenda driven, it's always with a certain push in mind, and the people who are doing it are programmed to believe it's for one thing, but in the end there's only one winner, and that's either the creation of chaos or the elite achieve more power.
Yeah, do you know what? Do you know for me though, the big fundamental, you're absolutely right, history does have a tendency of repeating itself. The big difference is what's coming now is not going to be something that history has ever seen before. Ultimately, yeah, it doesn't mean we won't see things happening in history that mirror things, but ultimately it's like the whole way the world will change is. And yes, at the moment, you've got people in many different camps who have divided on political grounds, non-political grounds. It can be divided on multiple grounds. The problem you have in the US at the moment is more or less, you call it a deep state, cabal, whatever you want, has pretty much towed the line. There's different elements who have, and historically this is true for the last 100 years, you have a very different perspective on the role the United States should play in the world and how they go about doing things. But ultimately, they kind of found a way to coexist. But that coexistence has gone out the window, and it's now becoming apparent that it's a dog-eat-dog situation. So, and we've not had that. That's one thing we haven't had, where I don't like to sort of pigeonhole people into camps, but you've got the Trump administration, or Trump, who is literally, I mean, there was an argument when he started out, he's supposed to take a wrecking ball to the deep state cabal. Well, he's not so much doing that as just taking a wrecking ball to anything and everything, and is kind of had a sort of stance where it was very almost becoming isolationist, turning away from all the institutions. And I'm not criticizing, saying I've got a reservation about NATO. I don't like the World Health Organization. I don't like all these institutions which have failed for a whole different bunch of reasons since their inception, and not necessarily failed, but failed from humanity's perspective. And then, but in the next breath, he's kind of given this, relaxed all these banking rules, allowing banks to do reckless speculation at precisely the worst point in history. And, this ridiculous foreign policy which contradicts things. So there's all these conflicting things. And now suddenly, because China's in ascent, Trump's now suddenly wanting to get all the people that he angered, the European Union, all these nations, to go, well, we need to have this unified approach to containing China. And all these nations are looking at it and going, hang on a minute. Well, A, we're not doing it, and B, you're contradicting yourself. So Trump's kind of, for me, is all over the place. All his administration's all over the place doing contradictory things. In the last week or so, I've seen with regards to Trump's attitude to things, some pretty disturbing developments from my perspective, which I think is extremely worrying. In some part, he is, and I'm not saying he is, but he's giving the impression almost of trying to now somehow be a bit autocratic in his leadership, which people will disagree with me, but I see things that concern me. And then the problem is, it's debatable where he fits in this, because he's not a cabal person. He never was, but he's kind of half cabal, half isn't. And there was a tendency, of trying to move the US back 100 years. when the US was about isolationism, was kind of unfettered capitalism, for want of a better word, and not wanting to really get involved on the world stage. So there's a lot of that where he's doing that. And then there's the flip side where they're still meddling in nations. They're trying to get rid of Maduro. They're still trying to meddle in Nicaragua and Cuba. They're still meddling in Ukraine. They're trying to meddle in China, and they're trying to meddle in Hong Kong. So there's all these contradictions. And then you've got this other camp, which maybe it is Democrat based, maybe it's something where they're actually still want to go for globalization with a capital G, which is more sort of cabal globalization. They want to keep relations on the world stage. Well, they kind of sort of do, and they don't. They're kind of not sure they want to be with China, but they don't really want to be with Russia. And then you've got some other elements within this who hate China and Russia and don't want anything to do with them, but they still want some sort of globalization. And there's all these competing forces. They're all trying to rip each other apart inside the US, and it's simply because the US as an empire is collapsing. So all this order and structure they had is gone. So they're all going to keep tearing each other up, or trying to tear each other apart, particularly because you've got the presidential elections coming up in November. And the Trump camp is full of deep state operatives for a completely different agenda to this globalization. But then some of them seem to be wanting globalization, but only on their terms. So it's very complex sort of dynamic that's existing inside the Beltway, for want of a better reason. But there's no cohesion. So you've now got this very disruptive, dysfunctional kind of deep state cabal who's pulling in all myriad of different directions. There's still some who are desperate for some war somewhere. There's ones who are going, we can't have a war anymore because Russia's going to hand our proverbials on a plate, and they know that. So you've got some people in the military now. The reason they don't want to be on the streets in the US is because for them it's a bridge too far. And I tend to agree. I think sticking the military on the streets of the US will be a disaster. I think it's disproportionate. I don't think you need to have that. But there's elements in the Trump camp who are desperately pushing for it. So that all these dysfunctional elements is not surprising, because the US is, as an empire, collapsing. But my goodness, it is muddying and complicating waters. But what I would say is there is nothing inside this current system, whatever your political leanings are, that is going to represent anything of that will provide the US with that unity and a way forward.
Paul,
and people will want to believe this, but it's not going to happen.
Paul, you said something very interesting earlier, and that's just the fact that, this is not isolated here in the United States. When you look at the revolutions that are occurring around the globe, the Yellow Vests, the Italians, there's a massive uprising that's occurring globally. Gentlemen, can you guys maybe articulate and discuss why do you think that that's happening?
Well, if you think about it, I don't know about in the UK, but in a couple of the other nations, Antifa is running wild in European countries. Okay, Antifa, pure and simple, is part of the open society, funded and forged and created by George Soros. It's using the exact models of the color revolutions of the 1990s and 2000s. Okay, pure and simple. It's exactly what is happening in the U.S. It's a color revolution type scenario. The key thing is, though, I have to ask this question. How in the hell do you get so many people from other countries who have never heard of George Floyd all of a sudden have this inside knowledge and this unity for something that has nothing to do with them? I saw this tweet. It was hilarious. The police are out there stopping the people from stopping the people from attacking the Antifa protesters, whatever. But these are the same people who allow the refugees to gang rape and their own people. So the police are in on it. The government's in on it. it is so intertwined. You don't get this type of global coordination for anything in this short amount of time if there was not elements and agents across the world who were all tied into this. The thing about it is if it was a lot more chaotic and unorganized, I would say, you know what, it's a random case, but there is too much pure organization across the board pushing for this move of chaos to say that it wasn't just a spur of the moment thing. They were waiting for an event. If there wasn't some planning with the event, and they were ready to go at a moment's notice.
Ken, I have to say, with regards to Europe, Europe is not the United States in more ways than I can express. Look, we look at France. France has had the yellow vests for well over a year. These are just normal run-of-the-mill people who've had enough. They've had enough of the French political system. They've had enough of the European Union. We've had massive protests in the last few years in Spain. We've had them sporadically across Northern Europe. They've had protests in Italy on and off. There's a groundswell of people in Europe who've had enough for a long time, and we've had protests. I'm not saying that you can argue there's some organisation, but okay, there was a big protest in Hyde Park in London. It was very peaceful. They're just regular people. You can. I mean, I'm not saying you don't get organisation, but you'd be surprised at the moment. There's a lot of people who want to latch on to something. They're desperate because they feel completely let down. So if they hear there's something organised in Hyde Park, they will turn up. But they're just regular people. There wasn't any violence. There wasn't any. I mean, there's odd places in London where there's been a bit of a scuffle with the police, but nothing of any substance. I mean, yeah, you'll get some hot-headed people, but what's going on in the US is not what's going on in Europe. I'm not saying it won't end up that way. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it might not descend into total chaos in the end. But there is an awful lot of people around the world who've said, I just don't know what it is anymore, but I've had enough. You know, I've talked to people in the last few years when I had neighbors who were saying to me, I don't know what it is, but I've had enough. There's something not right. I can't put my finger on it because I don't understand. There is an awakening. So it's not all about organization. There is a lot of people increasingly who have just had enough. And there's a lot of people who actually understand things from a regular kind of walk of life that you wouldn't expect to, who actually, believe it or not, understand far more than a lot of people in the alt media who love to think they're so enlightened and understand things. You go and talk to the average person on the street in the UK, and they'll tell you, I know the political system wrong. I know the financial system wrong. I know this. I know that. I'm frustrated. I don't know what I can do about it, but I know there's big trouble coming. So when something happens, yeah, people will galvanize around it. But again, it's more the question they're galvanizing because they want to find something else to latch onto. It's not what's happening in Europe is very, very different from the US. And there will be coordination, and I'm not saying on some level, but it's not like that particularly here. And we just have to accept there's a lot of people out there who will just latch on to something because they feel it more represents their views. It's not a political thing. It's just something they believe in. I think the problem we've got to get over is this idea that now in this world, everything's going to be organized by this cabal. Everything's this. It isn't. There's going to be a lot of random, spontaneous behavior from people who have had enough. And as we go through this economic collapse, you can guarantee there's going to be more and more and more. We have a history in the UK. We had 1 million people marched about the war in Iraq. There might have been some political thing, but people did it because they genuinely were opposed to it. It wasn't some big political thing to try and create something. It just happened. It's like Brexit. People just said, we've had enough. We don't want to be part of the European Union. And they voted by a majority to leave. Okay, there's lots of different reasons why people voted. So there is a precedent where we are seeing change. And sometimes we have to start giving credit that people might know a lot more than we think, are actually motivated to want change, and not just assume it's all orchestrated, because seriously, in Europe, that's not the case.
Well, the thing about it is you're absolutely right. I remember I saw and read up on that that march, Hyde Park, you said?
Yes.
Yeah, where they were just, and people were peaceful. But I'm when I say Europe, that doesn't mean the UK. Okay, the second day that the riots started happening, the protests turning into riots here in the United States, a ton of immigrant refugees in Paris who were, for the last 2 weeks, pretty much firebombing the police in the no-go zones. They did a massive march and protest. Sweden was the one place I was talking about. There's a picture of a European, I don't know if it's the UK, but a policewoman who is kneeling around a bunch of protesters and rioters and saying, I'm sorry for my white privilege. The police, you have the police kneeling to the protesters and rioters here in the United States. You have white kids in Generation Z licking the boots of black people for this guilt. This goes beyond wanting change. This is where a programming of society has reached a fever pitch in amongst all of this. And I don't see where even the people have the fortitude anymore to actually be able to survive the coming crisis.
Well, look, yeah, of course it's going to be a monumental problem, but it's not insurmountable. The problem is the vast majority of people will have some sort of leaning towards something. They want to believe in something that's political, or they have something they don't like about this, or they like about that. And that around that they form, that's their basis of thought about everything. That's the problem with the Trump supporters. Trump, as I made a really crass joke, if Trump said stick your head in a gas oven, they do it. But this is where it's wrong. People it's almost like a tribal thing where people always have to hang on to something instead of just going, this is all failed. This doesn't work anymore. It's not working. And I think we have to give a lot of credit that there are more people out there who now realize that these things don't work anymore. They just don't have a voice. So yes, because they may do something or latch onto something and act in a certain way doesn't necessarily mean it's all programming. It's just an expression. You were trying to explain a situation that's so chaotic, it's so dysfunctional, that people who may think so may act in a certain way and do something. But we're not in a time where people are going to sit there and necessarily go, okay, I'm going to rationally think about this. I'm going to try and understand things. They'll do all sorts of things. Yeah, there might be some element of that, but it's not entirely. And it doesn't, and what we perceive from our perspective as being completely wrong, doesn't mean from their perspective that it's a program. They may just be reacting to something. Yeah, I'm not saying it's this complicated, and none of this is black and white. It's all myriads of shades of grey, and everyone's going to have to, some point is going to have to say, this has all failed. None of it is working. What do? We have to move into the middle ground and go, right, now we need to start thinking about this. And how do you, that's the complicated part, is if you're a Trump supporter, forget about being a Trump supporter. If you support the Democrats, forget about that. Realize that something far bigger and far more important has to happen. It's the same in the UK. You have to ditch all your political ideology, ditch all your belief systems, because they're all failed. What has to change? That is the thing. And until people come together in the middle and have a unified idea and start, and it doesn't have to start at government level. It has to start where people engage with each other in the street, or engage with each other, with their neighbors, and start to have these conversations and start to realize that they're not unique. Because, there's a lot of people out there who are frightened because they go, where the hell's my future? What am I going to do? But because we kind of all sit and isolate ourselves in this world that we live in now, where everyone sort of has virtual relationships a lot of the time, these are the core problems. But until people come together in the middle and start to have a united attitude and start towards, it's like, I get people who I'll criticize Trump and they'll call me a communist, they'll call me a left wing, they'll call me a Democrat, they'll call me all manner of things. I'm going, excuse me, I'm making a valid observation that in this point, Trump's wrong. That doesn't make me anything. That is critically thinking. And we've lost this ability to divorce a person's opinion. Therefore, it means you're one thing or the other. It doesn't. And these are fundamental problems. Until we address those, no, you're right, nothing is going to change. So if you want to believe that Trump's the solution, you're going to be horribly upset and disappointed. If you believe the Democrats are the solution, you're going to be horribly upset and disappointed. None of those are solutions. The solution is completely different.
No, I'm 100% behind you in that. You hit the nail on the head. Those here at the Gadfly, especially watching the comments, reading, and those who stay with us because of the dialogue that we do and the information we provide, are people who critically think. Okay,
mm-hmm.
They may support Trump for certain things, but they disregard him for others. I'm of that camp. I don't put him as he's not deep state. But he is inept and politically inept in many different ways in trying to deal with this. It's like there's a simmering fire that's going on, and then you throw in Trump, and it just makes everything worse. But the point is that the rest of the world, you had that conversation with somebody outside of the Gadfly, and they just, rejected it, put up defensive walls, and thought you were the worst thing in the world. Probably that came. Think about the conversations you see around on the media or TV and this and that. When somebody's losing an argument, the first thing they do is you're a sexist, you're a bigot, you're a racist. The thing that stands out to me is this thing started out, quote unquote, George Floyd, police brutality. There was never, from the very beginning, let's have a dialogue on this, okay? Because the dialogue is the fact of the matter, 10 unarmed black men were killed last year out of 330 million. Yes, it happens. I doubt, and most people who critically think doubt, that very few of them have to do with race. They have to do with militarized police, inept, and people who shouldn't be in law enforcement to begin with. But that is never put up because that doesn't sell newspapers and get clicks. Okay, it's inflaming emotions. And when I say programming, I don't mean MK Ultra, their program. But the fact of the matter is that psychologists who work with the media, who work with politicians, who are all part of this, is if you can get somebody emotionally charged on something, you own them and you can direct them in whatever direction you want to do. That's why sensationalism rules the roost. Logical thinking's out the window. I hate to say it. And, you and I, CJ, and that we're trying to bring that back. I think the problem is, and this is just my personal thought on it, is during this frequency shift we're going through, in this paradigm shift, you almost can't introduce solutions until the chaos has run its course. You wait until the aftermath, and then you can introduce, look, we need to rebuild, and we need to rebuild on real fundamentals. That's just my personal thought on it, because I have had so many conversations with people to try to listen to their side. And when I listen to their side, they have nothing to say. It's just emotionally charged psychobabble. And then when I start bringing up facts and evidence and what do you think about this solution, they can't even think about coming to a good solution. They just have this built up emotional hatred and they want to take it out on somebody. And I think really that's what we're seeing now. The oppression and culmination of financial fear, lack of family, lack of education, all this politics, it's reaching a head. like perhaps it did in '68. You know, real quick, I'll end on this. Remember in 1968, the United States was starting to have high inflation because the rest of the world was rejecting the dollar. France didn't want dollars, they wanted their gold. We were only 3 years away from going off the gold standard and bringing in a decade of stagflation. It's pretty similar to what we're having now. We're having the riots occur when the world is rejecting the dollar, and we are about to turn to a new financial and currency system. So when that happens, there's going to be a decade of, I don't want to say stagflation, but utter hell that's going to make what we're doing now seem like a walk in the park. But what comes in the aftermath of all of this, that's where we need to rebuild on the fundamentals of decency, of family, of cohesion, of neighbors, of society, of civilized, and stop letting those who would use us as fodder for their agenda, stop letting those people have power, because without us, they wouldn't be in positions where they could dominate us.
Gentlemen, how do we redirect? Obviously, I think that the racism, the thing, is more of a byproduct of the oppression that is occurring. So how do we redirect people's attention to the understanding that, look, systematically both parties have failed us. There's not a solution with the current system. What is the effort to redirect to get them to understand the true criminality of what's occurred and why we have all the wealth and income disparity that we have in the country? How do we begin to have those conversations, win the conversation, to redirect people to understand that, their efforts and who they should really be angry with at this point?
Well, you've hit the nail squarely on the head, CJ. The problem is, it's an enormous problem on so many levels, and it's the one thing that annoys me more about the old media than anything. They had a perfect opportunity to focus on the important things and to galvanize people around this, and instead most of it went off in there with all the reasons we've discussed before. That is why I get really annoyed with large sections of it, because they're not interested in that. But anyway, getting back to the point is, unfortunately, it's never too late to start. And in our way, we try to do this, and we're not unique by any stretch. There are other people trying to do this. The problem is, it's a bit like the chicken and egg, isn't it? It's kind of like, what comes first? And the only thing, I think, unfortunately, it's at the moment, there is sections of American society who are disenfranchised, disaffected, fearful, resentful, angry for all the reasons, and a lot of it is absolutely justified. It might not be justified from one person's perspective, but it is justified. I think the problem is that has been there for a long time, and nothing's been done to address it. It's probably literally going to be the sheer weight of numbers that eventually means a huge amount of other people are going to get sucked into that, because they're going to lose everything. They'll lose their jobs. People's pension funds will evaporate. All the security they felt they have will evaporate. And eventually there's going to be enough people in the US and elsewhere who are going to suddenly go, this American dream is bullshit. And they're going to realize why and then they're going to start wanting answers. And that groundswell of people is then going to force a change, because if you've then got 100 million Americans who want to peacefully protest, what are they going to do? Send in the army and shoot them all? No. Are they going to arrest them all? No. They're going to have to. And in a way, it's the crude analogy when the ton of manure is on everyone's doorstep and they can't get out the front door because the manure is in their way. Then you might start to see it, because unfortunately, most people's attitude is, it's not my problem until it becomes my problem. I don't care about all these things. Yeah, they may superficially say they care about things, but ultimately they don't. All they care about is their own well-being. Well, And then as soon as that well-being's threatened, then, oh my goodness, it's the end of the world. And that is going to increasingly engulf more and more people. And the difference, I think, this time is this is going to affect people. Okay, we had the Great Depression in the United States. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but it hasn't happened in most people's living memory. The world's a very different place. People were more stoic and tolerant then. You're not going to have that level of tolerance. And also the coping mechanism. People coped in 100 years ago with things people now couldn't cope with. As someone said to me only recently, people's coping mechanism goes out the window if you switch their Wi-Fi off for 24 hours. And that's the problem. There's no understanding of what's important and what's relevant. But I think that's the tipping point. And that's the point where increasingly people then are going to turn around and go, well, who's got the answers? Well, and the government's not going to have the answers. They don't, because they're running scared already. They don't know how to deal with anything. Contrary to the idea that it's all controlled and they know exactly what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. They're terrified because they know what's coming. And they now know it's not going to be what people who've been, disenfranchised for the last 50, 100 years, whatever it is. It's going to suck a whole bunch of other people in. And sadly, I think in a way, it comes back to the point until everyone's on their knees, then they're going to want answers. The problem is who's going to provide those answers, and it's what Ken and I discussed on Monday. Where are these people? Where are these people who can grab the American nation and say, okay, this is what we need to do, and this is how we need to do it? I don't see these people. I'm sure, do you know what? There's probably somebody sat somewhere in a living room now, somewhere in the United States, who'd be the greatest president that ever walked the earth. There's probably some people out there who'd be the greatest of all these things, but they never have had an opportunity. And you can't suddenly pull these people from nowhere. So there is probably going to be this period of huge, Ken talks about stagflation, it's stagnation. But the problem in that situation is the risk is someone else will try and fill this vacuum. And that's why I fear with the US, and not exclusively, there's all these competing forces who are going to they'll rip each other apart in the process in just the hope that, they may lose an arm and a leg, but they'll be the last man standing. And I'm not saying that will happen, but it is a fear I have. And therefore, the truth is at the moment, I don't know. For me, there's 100 main points that I know would rebuild America. I just don't see the people there to make that happen. And I don't see enough galvanizing forces to build a movement that says, we're going to cut across all these divides and we can pull people together and make these things happen. And that's why I feel the US will stagger along for a number of years, just in utter turmoil. And I think the psychological impact on people, for some people, it's going to be liberating because they felt downtrodden all their lives for a whole bunch of reasons. But there's going to be a whole bunch of people out there who think they've been living the American dream because it's all working swimmingly for them. They're going to be crushed on so many levels, not just financially, psychologically. And I don't know. I really don't know at this point how you pull these people together. That all we can do is keep doing what we're doing and hoping that another person listens and someone else listens. And it's the old acorns, oak trees are grown, but we can only do what we can do. And that's in whatever limited capacity. We don't have, Twitter following of 5 million people. That's what I get frustrated. These people out there with these big Twitter following who have absolutely nothing of substance to say. It's vacuous bullshit. And it's just so frustrating because if we were in that position, we would want to use that platform to say there has to be an alternative way. So we're a very small minnow swimming in a sea of, well, not just sharks, but a sea of incompetence and people who are just milking this gravy train because they don't think it's ever going to end. But at some point it will end for them. It will end for everybody. But who fills that vacuum, and how someone or a group fits in. Maybe it's just an organic thing. Maybe it will just have to slowly evolve, where people will gradually over time start to realize, and therefore it will have to be chaos that gradually becomes less chaos. But the problem is America is so broken, it's so divided. How do you possibly suddenly galvanize a whole bunch of people to start to realize that if you don't come together, you're not going to affect the change? But
well, I think there's something that we probably didn't mention over the past few podcasts, but it really stuck in my head. Besides the wealth disparity, what has completely been shattered? I mean, obviously the Constitution and our type of government here in the States is supposed to be a contract with the people. But what is gone now is the rule of law. It is utterly gone. We saw it, in its major form, how the banks were bailed out for their corruption and fraud, while 4 million people lost their homes in foreclosure. We saw the events leading up to the election. Hillary Clinton, the Snowdens and the Chelsea Mannings, whatever, were not only arrested and jailed, but some of them had to flee in exile. While Hillary Clinton, who signs actual documents saying that she will protect classified information, keeps a private server, and nothing happens. We see this with Barr coming out and saying, well, what the FBI did wasn't criminal, even though it is criminal. Instead, it was dereliction of duty. The fact of the matter is that when the rule of law is no longer in place, then it opens the door then for lawlessness. And if you want to think about it, what's going on is sheer lawlessness. The Mayor de Blasio and a number of other mayors in cities are ordering their police to do nothing while people and property are killed and ransacked and looted. You said about that we don't want troops in the streets. Well, there was one poll that came out, a survey. 71% of Americans wanted Trump to send military in the thing because their state and local governments are doing nothing. They don't really want that military in the streets. But if their own politicians are not going to do anything, their own leaders, they're desperate. Okay.
Yeah, but you know why all these leaders don't want to do anything? Because because they're terrified it will turn into an enormous bloodbath and they'll be held responsible.
Well,
and that's the problem. A lot of it is just fear and incompetence and not taking responsibility and a dereliction of their own duty to make the right decisions. That's what we're increasingly seeing. It's not corruption. It's just crass incompetence because they're the wrong people to manage things. It's the same with the virus. Very poor decisions were made, but it's not all based in corruption. I'm not saying there aren't corrupt whoever in government or at the state level or municipal level or anything else. That's not what I'm saying. But fundamentally, what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 months is a lot of it is just crass incompetence and inability to do their job.
Yeah. I mean, I can agree with that. To me, I look at corruption not just in fraud and purposeful, but it's like with a machine. Okay, when the parts start to fail, they're corrupted. Okay, the parts that fit into society, whether it's the politicians we elect, whether it's the laws that we have, when those no longer function the way they should, to me, that's corruption. Okay. The system is corrupted. But with that being said, rather than get into the thing, the division between the rich and the rest of America, the laws for thee and laws for me, the division between that, it's not surprising that people have just thrown up their hands and are saying, you know what, if the law doesn't matter anymore, we're just going to do what we want. And when a society suddenly breaks down because of the rule of law, uh, and the incompetence of leadership, unfortunately, this is part of what happened in Germany, which led to the rise of Hitler. The Weimar Republic was incompetent, and they throw in 80-year-old Otto von Bismarck, who was, pretty much senile, and they needed a leader to come out of to bring them out of the bootstraps of the World War I and the Versailles Treaty, and it opens the door for Hitler. That's me in America. What I'm afraid of. Obviously, the Democrats are idiots for putting up a Hindenburg himself, or I'm sorry, not Bismarck. Hindenburg was chancellor at the time. But they're bringing Biden, who can't even tie his shoes and remember what day it is, instead of bringing up somebody like an Obama who has this charisma, whether he's a communist or a dictator or not. There is going to be somebody who's going to rise if the lawlessness continues, if the financial collapse continues, and the people don't have a solution, a real solution put before them. It's going to open the door for that authoritarian or dictator and strongman to come say, I will save you. And then all hell's going to break loose after that.
I suppose the problem is, though, who? I mean, because
you never know.
But I don't think that's going to be feasible. I think the one thing we have moved on in the last 100 years, I just don't see how you're going to be able to have that kind of. I mean, within the existing political system, for want of a better word, and someone coming, then but if that all evaporates, you're not going to get someone who is going to be able to achieve those objectives in this day and age, and particularly in a nation the size of the United States. And I mean, never say never, but I would be extremely surprised if that happens. I think the biggest problem is there'll just be nothing there. And then it's almost like, who the hell wants to run the United States? Who wants to be president now? And the question is, who would be? But I think that one of the most interesting comments and the biggest signal to me that everybody, whatever persuasion they are, politically, deep state, cabal, whatever you want to call them, that they know that the US is in terminal decline, is when George W. Bush stated the other day, it's time for America to examine our tragic failures. What he's basically saying is, we're panic stricken. We know people are going to start demanding answers. They're all going to point fingers at the likes of us. So we need to jump that and start to say, oh, there's been all these problems. They need to be addressed. That is a statement of abject fear. And for someone in the Bush camp to say that proves they know it's over. They know they have their power base, or whatever it might be, whatever we want to believe it is going, it's evaporating. And when everything collapses, the most vulnerable people in the United States are actually going to be the so-called 1%, because the one thing that will always happen is that the people deemed to be the most affluent, the one who have the power or perceived power, are going to be the ones that are most at risk, because the collective majority is going to turn around and go, well, you were in office, you were captains of industry, you were in corporations, you're the people to blame, because it's pretty obvious now that we were lied to for a very long time for all these bunch of reasons. So I think when Bush came out with that, that's the biggest indication of them holding up a white flag going, please don't hurt us, don't hold us responsible, in the sense that, because we're terrified of what's coming. And I think he was speaking for an awful lot more people by saying that.
Yeah, I kind of thought it was fascinating that on that very same day, Bush, Obama, and General Mattis comes out of the attic to pretty much decry Trump's leadership of the situation, not touching on the fact that the states themselves, the governors themselves, the mayors themselves, it was all pointed to Trump, 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 Trump. He's bad man orange. But the Bushes played both political parties. They funded both sides of it. It's all about power in that. Unfortunately, when Papa Bush died, for the deep state, they lost somebody who had an authoritarian control over that bureaucracy. But the last thing I want to point is, you made a great point. You don't see America bringing in a strongman. As you were saying that, I was thinking about what is happening in certain areas around the country. In California, when the Antifa and the rioters started going into certain sections of LA County, the Latin Kings started gunning them down. You don't enter our territory. In Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, 100 armed citizens came out and said, if Antifa even comes into our town, we're going to just, take care of them. They're not. I think we're going to see a division of states. There's going to be, instead of coming in a unified, there's going to be a division, not to the point of civil war, but communities are going to come in on themselves and want to, if we don't, they're going to stick with who they trust, because trust is, along with the rule of law and the family and all these things, have been thrown out the window. And when trust is gone, especially with the nation, and instead you're looking out for yourself, it's really difficult to find a solution, because that takes years, if not generations, to regain.
Yep.
Yeah. You've just on a point in that regard. I had a conversation with someone back in 2007, and this, for me, I mean, obviously I didn't know what was going to unfold in the aftermath of 2008 or what 2008 was going to be. But for me, there was a clear understanding that the Western financial system was going to collapse. I didn't know what the outcome would be, but I had a conversation with someone in 2007 saying, look, as far as I'm concerned, it's going to collapse. And they went, yes. I said, I just wonder what the future ultimately will be for the US, in not as necessarily assuming that it was going to be complete meltdown, but for me, there was always this idea that the US dollar was never going to last long term. Okay, what's the implication? And they said to me, there was an understanding that the US probably, to survive, will end up breaking up into various parts. And do you know what? Increasingly, I could see, for example, California just breaking off and doing whatever California wants to. I can see sections of the US forming. I'm trying to think what word you would use. I have to be extremely careful, because I don't want to say something that would be politically charged, but you might get groups of states who decide, well, we're going to just form some sort of union. I think you might see the US break up into 4, 5, 6 pieces, and for all sorts of reasons. And that might be the way the US long term can survive. I'm not sure this idea of having 50 states has a long term future for the US. I think it's kind of just isn't working. It's rather a bit like a far more mature version of what they tried to do in Europe, and it doesn't work. And I don't know whether ultimately a 50-state solution from the US is the future. And one other small point, someone's going to have to sit down and, for me, rewrite the Constitution and make it work for the 21st century and for the next 100 or 200 years or whatever. I think the Constitution, okay, it's been abused and for all the reasons, but I think some group of people in the future is going to have to sit down and go, maybe this doesn't work anymore. Maybe we have to rewrite some things. Don't obliterate it, but make it work for the future. And I think that might go a long way to solving a lot of problems in the US as well. Assuming, of course, you have the rule of law and all the things that have gone out the window, as you rightly say, Ken.
Gentlemen, there's no doubt we're at a pivotal moment in history. Closing thoughts to wrap up this session.
I think we said it all. If anything, you know what we're seeing is a culmination of even more than 12 years, going back to the global financial crisis. These things have been percolating for decades. Even if you want to go back to the time that the dollar became the global reserve currency and the world went on a fiat currency system. Once that happened, the countdown started. Nobody knows the exact number of years or number of minutes or whatever, but inevitably every fiat currency system fails, collapses. And the one thing that stood out is this time in history, every single country is on a purely fiat currency system. So when one implodes, they'll all implode. And the only question that remains is what is going to come after the aftermath and who is going to be the leaders of the new system. So the thing is you really can't predict that. You can only prepare for the best because that's where not only survivability, but thriving in that new system is the key component.
Paul.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can sort of add, although I mean we could talk for months and weeks about this, I think the thing for me that kind of surprises me more than anything, as a non-American, I sometimes think I care more about the future of America than most Americans do. No, let me rephrase that, not most, than too many Americans don't care about enough. And you know, and I in a way that might be careful how I say that, and don't mean that disrespectfully to, because there's a lot of people who do care about their nation, but I feel in this current climate that when you talk about America being a great nation amongst equals, and the world desperately needs that, and the world desperately wants it. I fear that for a lot of Americans, that's not acceptable. They want America to be top dog and to remain top dog, and that's where I mean. And if America wants to be like that, it's not going to. It will never succeed. It's going to stay in the doldrums for the next 50 years. It has to be this understanding that has to go away. So when I talk about caring about America, it's because for me, I don't think enough Americans at the moment understand that that's a big dynamic shift that has to happen. So I apologize. I don't know if anyone takes offense to what I said. I don't probably should have phrased it better, but I think there is a big fundamental shift that has to happen in a lot of American people's mind as to how the future of America should be. And, you know, as a non-American, I desperately want this to happen, because if it doesn't, it not only affects the lives of 340 million American people, it's going to have a huge effect on the rest of the world going forward, because an unstable America is extremely bad news for the rest of the world, not least because of its nuclear arsenal. I mean, you know, there's just one small point about this. Not that I'm saying we'll have World War III or Armageddon or anything, but I think it's extremely important that the US recalibrates, and also for me that caring about the US and the long-term future, there has to be a shift in mindset as to what that means. And that's probably what I should have said and not what I started with.
Gentlemen, thank you for a great conversation, and for our Gadfly subscribers, thank you once again for supporting our multi-channel network. If you're tuning in for the very first time to our work, you know, the conversation that you heard is just the reason why the work that we're doing here at the Gadfly is just so important. So please go check out thegadfly.vhx.tv. You can learn about our premium content, which is $10 a month. You get a 30-day free trial to listen in. And then from that point, either $10 a month or $100 a year, you'll see the likes and the great work from not only Ken Shortkin Jr. that's here with his work, London Paul, but also Jim Willie. So, gentlemen, thank you for a great conversation, and we will do this again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thanks, everyone.